Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Aaron Gilchrist, and we begin with breaking news in the apparent second assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump. At any moment now, we expect the FBI, Secret Service, and Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office to hold a news conference. You're looking at live pictures from where that will be happening. They're going to brief us on the investigation after authorities say a Secret Service agent fired on a would-be assassin hiding in the bushes outside former President Trump's golf course in West Palm Beach, Florida, yesterday afternoon. Now, NBC News was first to obtain a new angle of the arrest as the suspect was arrested along a highway after he'd run from the golf club.
2 steps to your right. Take 2 steps to your right. Driver, walk straight back. Yep. You want to go with Keep walking.
What's your name, Austin? Ryan?
Ryan Ruth appeared in court earlier today charged with 2 federal counts: possession of a firearm by a convicted felon and possession of a firearm with an obliterated serial number. He's expected to face additional charges as well. Now, according to authorities and the new criminal complaint, Ruth was armed with a loaded rifle with a scope just a few hundred yards from where Mr. Trump was golfing at his Florida club yesterday. And according to phone records, the suspect had been waiting in that area nearly 12 hours. When an agent noticed a rifle through the bushes, they opened fire and Mr. Trump was rushed to safety. Now, officials say as he ran, Ruth left behind his weapon, a digital camera, a backpack, and a bag of food. The 58-year-old suspect has faced more than 100 criminal charges in the past, including a conviction for possessing a machine gun. In interviews and posts on social media, he's described himself as a disillusioned former Trump supporter and a vocal supporter of Ukraine. Although Ruth's motives are not yet known, the former president today blamed his political rivals, Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, for this incident, telling Fox News Digital, quote, "Their rhetoric is causing me to be shot at," and later posting on social media that because of their rhetoric, quote, "the bullets are flying and it will only get worse." Now, Vice President Harris released a statement saying in part, quote, "I condemn political violence. We all must do our part to ensure that this incident does not lead to more violence." And President Biden also condemning the attack a short time ago on camera. This was during an event in Philadelphia.
Let me just say, there is no, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, those of you who know me, many of you do, no place in political violence for political violence in America. None. Zero. Never. I've always condemned political violence. I always will in America. In America, we resolve our differences peacefully at the ballot box, not at the end of a gun. America suffered too many times the tragedy of an assassin's bullet. It solves nothing and just tears the country apart. We must do everything we can to prevent it and never give it any oxygen.
Joining me now from West Palm Beach is NBC's Garrett Hake. Tom Winter with us as well as Robert McDonald, retired supervisory special agent for the U.S. Secret Service. Garrett, I want to start with you, and obviously as soon as this news conference gets started behind you, we will go to the speakers there at the podium. I know we've heard from former President Trump, both on his social media and in interviews reacting to this apparent assassination attempt. Broadly, this is different from what we've heard from him in the past in the wake of that July attempt on his life. How is he viewing this incident versus the last attempt back in July?
Yeah, Aaron, in this case, the former president has skipped right over what was that introspective period following the first assassination attempt, the calls for unity that we saw at the Republican National Convention. Now the president is just angry. We see it in his social media posts, and we hear it in the 1 or 2 interviews that he has given thus far, blaming this second attempt on his life on the rhetoric of the vice president and of President Biden, lashing out. We're seeing it from his campaign with calls from Harris and Biden to denounce those in the Democratic Party who've suggested that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. No calls for unity here, no kind of broader message of turning things down across the country. It's anger and focus on the top of the Democratic ticket from Donald Trump.
So, Garrett, I know this incident yesterday obviously was not a campaign event. This was the former president out doing what he normally does, out golfing. It wasn't something the public would have been aware of. Is the campaign shifting plans at all as a result of what happened yesterday in Florida?
Well, Aaron, in terms of their official public schedule, the answer is no. The campaign's been very clear that Donald Trump's going to continue with his campaign events this week. He's got a town hall in Michigan tomorrow. He's an event tonight at Mar-a-Lago that has nothing to do with the campaign. He's launching a new crypto program just for his own personal brand. All of that is the show must go on. But what changes might be being made to the security posture around some of the events, or how things like the rest of the former president's schedule, like a golf outing, which is typically treated as what we'd call an OTR movement, a lot less of the visible security preparations, the security screenings, a smaller package of Secret Service and other officials traveling around him. If those changes are being made, we don't know about them yet, and we may not ever be told about them. The Secret Service may simply decide to make those changes unilaterally and quietly.
Which is something we would expect from the Secret Service. Garrett Haig for us in Florida today. Garrett, thank you. I want to turn to Tom Winter now. Tom, you've obviously been following this from the law enforcement perspective, what you've been able to gather from your sources. What do we expect to hear at this news conference starting in a couple of minutes here?
Well, that's right. I think we'll get an update on the investigative efforts so far. The FBI very active right now in the Palm Beach community, particularly near with this golf course, going around and getting surveillance video, canvassing the area for that video, and putting it all together. According to our team that's on the ground there, what I anticipate we'll get an update on is if they anticipate further charges down the line, if this individual has said anything, if they're any closer to a motive, and then address the question about whether or not this individual had any communications with anybody overseas. To be clear, I have not heard that, but that's the type of thing at this point that they would have some sort of communications or some sort of a sense of what those communications were, and then any details about how this may go from here. And I know they're starting to assemble. It's possible. We have asked for it under Florida public records laws to get access to some more of the video that police may have had, as well as any messages and 911 calls.
Tom, we're going to cut you off here and go to this NBC News special report. I'm Aaron Gilchrist. You've been watching an NBC News special report on the apparent second assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump. And moments ago, authorities updated reporters on their investigation. You saw that here live. Among the developments there, the acting Secret Service director, Ron Rowe, says the suspect here, Ryan Ruth, was never able to fire a shot before he ran from Mr. Trump's golf club. Now, he took off after a Secret Service agent spotted him and fired at him. That agent was well in advance, we're told, hundreds of yards from where Mr. Trump was golfing at that moment. Investigators also say that they've attempted to interview the suspect, but he invoked his right to an attorney. Now, the acting Secret Service director also saying that his agency needed what he called a paradigm shift in its procedures to keep its protectees safe, and that the threat environment facing them was, quote, unprecedented. Now, as we mentioned earlier, Ruth was charged with 2 federal counts, possession of a firearm by a convicted felon and possession of a firearm with an obliterated serial number. He is expected to face additional charges as well. Joining me now is NBC News Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley. Also back with us, Robert McDonald, retired supervisory special agent from the U.S. Secret Service. Julia, I'll start with you here. This notion that the Secret Service director said he ordered a paradigm shift after the July 13th incident involving the former president. What stood out to you in the remarks that we heard today from these law enforcement leaders?
Yeah, you're right, Aaron. The acting director, Rowe, does not shy away from really strong language. It's similar to what he said before House and Senate committees after the July 13th incident, when he took the helm of the Secret Service after former director Kimberly Sheetal left in the aftermath of that incident, that he wants a big shift in the way Secret Service handles security because of what he calls the dynamic threat environment they're living in now. But there are 2 things, Aaron, that he did not directly answer, and I want to flag those. One is that he said that there were counter unmanned aerial systems, which means ways to counter drones. Now, that's different from what he said before Senate committees, that he wanted to increase drone surveillance. So it's unclear. We still have a question about whether or not drones were actually used at this golf course, even though he said they were going to start that. Has that program started specifically for Trump? Because that would have been a way they could have seen this shooter, or attempted shooter. As we know now, he was in the area for 12 hours. Could this have been prevented earlier if they had used aerial surveillance? That's That's a big question. Another thing is when we heard Garrett Haake say, did the Trump campaign ask for more security, and what are you going to do about that? He just kept saying they have the highest level, and, you know, we're going to always reevaluate the threat. But as we've reported here at NBC just in the last couple hours, we understand the Trump campaign, as of this morning, did ask the Secret Service, specifically Acting Director Rowe, for more security, given the fact that this is now the second assassination attempt on Trump. Of course, Trump is coming out and applauding the Secret Service for their response, but there is a sense that when you have two incidents like these, maybe it's time to increase security. Now, I have been told that they've already raised his security far past what it was on July 13th, and you have to think about their other responsibilities to other protectees, including the current president of the United States and Harris, as she campaigns as well, and the vice presidential candidates and others. And they're also preparing for the United Nations General Assembly next week in New York. But essentially, this could turn into a wider conversation, Aaron, in which Congress would need to step in and appropriate more funding for the Secret Service if they are going to get to the level that the Trump campaign wants, and that potentially what Roe wants when he talks about that paradigm shift.
Well, Julia, I'll ask you to stand by here for us, and I want to turn to Robert McDonald, former retired Secret Service supervisory agent. Bobby, just your perspective on this, to hear the Secret Service director. One, we don't typically hear this much from a Secret Service director, and he laid out a fair amount of detail that isn't typically something the public is able to consume. But he also said that he wanted to move from a reactive model to a readiness model, which I thought was striking. How do you hear that from the director of the Secret Service?
Yeah, good afternoon, Aaron. Great to be with you again. You're absolutely right. We don't normally hear from the director of the Secret Service. And quite frankly, one of the issues that was the impetus to the downfall of former Director Cheeto was that she didn't participate in the press conference after Butler. I think it was very impressive today to see the acting director out showing some leadership, leading from the front, letting his troops know that the men and the women of the Secret Service are going to be looked after by him, and that he's going to support the work that they're doing every day. You know, as he said, we just had the RNC, we just had the DNC. You've got the UN General Assembly, which is going to be going on up in New York in the next week or so with 150 to 190 foreign heads of state. And then we've got the home stretch to the election time. So, yes, we've got 40 protectees that the service takes care of. It is time to shift, I think, a little bit of that paradigm. He is correct that the tried and true methods and policies of the Secret Service do work, and they did work yesterday. But I think it is also time to reboot and reset a little bit to maybe be a little bit more proactive than reactive, as he mentioned in his statement.
So what do you mean by that? More proactive than reactive in an instance like this? There is an element of policing that we know, law enforcement activity that we know is reactive, but there are some things that can be done proactively or ahead of time, if you will. In this instance, when we're looking at protecting a former president or anybody who's a Secret Service protectee, what do you mean by being more proactive? What would that look like? What could that look like? What could have been done differently here from your perspective?
Yeah, I think what we were talking about here is we want to augment the protective advance process. The protective advance process in Butler was a huge failure 60 days ago. And we saw where the gaps were in that communication process, in the liaison with the local police departments, and where things just went wrong. And several things went wrong in that situation. We then had very poor messaging that came out after that, a lack of transparency and why things happened, why those agents weren't put on administrative leave a little bit sooner after going through a catastrophic event like that. So a lot of questions are asked there, and I think the Secret Service needs to use these incidents that have happened to better themselves. As he just said, we have to have a no-fail mission every day. So the fact is that at certain times we're going to have to be reactive if something happens, but we need to be proactive. We need to go out and be on offense rather than defense in the course of our protective measures every day.
As I said, we got a level of detail from the Secret Service director that we don't typically get. He talked about having increased assets on the ground. He walked us through the layered approach that the agents were taking on that golf course with a front layer moving several holes ahead of where Mr. Trump was playing golf. And we were able to learn earlier today that the security apparatus included counter-assault, counter-surveillance, counter-sniper teams, as well as protective intelligence unit, a drone contingent, in addition to the personal protective detail there. To your mind, given that this was an off-the-record movement, not one that would have been publicly known, and you and I understand the difference between those two sorts of things. An off-the-record movement is, by its nature, slightly more safe than something that might be publicly known. What's your read on the apparatus that was around former President Trump at that moment? Appropriate? Not enough? Did everything go exactly as it should have gone in this instance from your perspective?
Well, in your typical off-the-record movement, as you mentioned, it's whether it's to a golf course or to an ice cream shop or whatever. If the Secret Service and the protectees staff doesn't know until 30 minutes before that event takes place, it's really tough for the bad guy to know that that event is going to take place. So the question I have here is, how did this individual know enough to secrete himself into the woods area or the public area just outside the fence some 12 hours before the former president happened to be at that golf course? The layered approach that he mentioned works here. The floating bubble, if you will, of agents out ahead, agents with the president, the hole he's playing, and then agents on the backside works. Kudos to that officer or that agent who was out ahead and saw that rifle barrel coming out of the woods or coming out of the fence line to be able to react. That individual was doing exactly what they're doing. We've been talking about the lead up to Butler, and perhaps the Secret Service had got a little complacent with its protective advance measures. That guy or gal did their job yesterday, and they did it well. They then engaged the shooter, and he was able to get away, and with the help of a wonderful citizen was able to get that information out. Secret Service is not going to chase after that guy. They're going to be worried about protecting the former president. And the communication and liaison apparatus that was in place there yesterday worked perfectly to get that individual, albeit 45 miles up I-95, which is very close to that golf course and very easy for him to get to. So again, all things considered, a very positive day all the way around by Secret Service and other state, local, and federal partners.
All right, thank you for that. Julia, very quickly before I let you go, that the question has been asked about whether this is an issue of resources, funding, or an allocation of resources, as we heard the Speaker of the House suggest earlier today. Do we have any understanding of, politically, here in Washington, what a next move might be as this investigation continues to roll out in Florida?
There are rumblings behind the scenes, particularly amongst appropriators on the Hill right now, that could be looking at providing more funding to Secret Service. The key thing, though, is that it takes about 2 years to onboard people with the level that you would need in order for them to go through the hiring process, the background process, and be trained, especially if they're in a really high position like a counter-sniper position or someone who's going to be very close to a protectee like Trump. So time might not be on their side, even if they have their money. What we see time and time again is that the Secret Service is pulling from other agencies, namely Homeland Security investigations. We know, for example, next week when the UN General Assembly gets underway, they'll have between 1,500 and 2,000 of those agents just to provide extra help. And of course, as we saw today, they also depend on local law enforcement. But this could be something that we hear more discussions about on the Hill. As we heard today from the acting director, they're doing just about as much as they can, he says, with the resources they currently have available.
All right, Julia Ainsley and Robert McDonald, thank you both for that. Now, as the acting Secret Service director said, this is an unprecedented threat environment that we're in. And joining me now to talk a little bit more about the unprecedented political environment we're in, Daniella Diaz, congressional reporter for Politico, Meghan Hayes, former special assistant to President Joe Biden on his communications team, and Brandan Buck, former advisor to Republican House Speakers Paul Ryan and John Boehner. He's also an NBC News political analyst. And Daniella, I'll start with you here. Obviously, the investigation is just starting. We heard from former President Trump blaming the language from President Biden, from Vice President Harris, for inspiring a would-be attacker here. It took a few weeks to get that sort of messaging coming from the last assassination attempt. Do you have a sense of how that language is landing at this point?
Well, I know how the investigation is going on Capitol Hill right now. And this all began with the first assassination attempt when they launched this task force to investigate what led to the first assassination attempt and what were the failures for Secret Service that led to Trump getting shot in Butler, Pennsylvania. But there are a lot of questions still about whether this rhetoric is actually affecting or triggering people to try to kill Donald Trump. There's a lot of questions surrounding this, which is why this investigation is still playing out. And that is what lawmakers want to see as they continue their investigation, see if they can get these questions answered.
So, Brandan, I'll turn to you here. And sort of the same question as we look at some of the language that's being used and the accusations being made at this point. The former president accusing Democrats of using inflammatory rhetoric that inspired the shooter. We can't help but to note that we've heard things from the former president as recently as this morning. He told Fox, quote, "Their rhetoric is causing me to be shot at when I am the one who's going to save the country, and they're the ones that are destroying the country, both from inside and out. These are people that want to destroy our country. It's called the enemy within. They are the real threat." What's your take on this situation and the words that are being used to address it from people who are running for public office?
Yeah, obviously, very different response. You remember last time it was all about unity and you wanted to come together and rise above it, and obviously we're getting none of that. And of course, Donald Trump, no stranger himself to using sort of out there language. I think the important thing is we have no idea whether any language had anything to do with this guy's actions yet. The reality is that, you know, I work for a lot of high-ranking people. It can be scary these days when you're in public high office. There are a lot of people out there who don't hear what people say politically in a rational way. They may not be all there together. We don't know what the mental status of this person was. And you have to worry about that person who's not hearing things like, oh, they understand that's just a phrase that people use. They may hear things more literally. Now, again, we don't know whether this person had anything to do with that, but it's just a reminder that there are people out there who don't hear things the same way that all of us do.
Meghan, strategically, obviously we heard from the president and the vice president last night suggesting, you know, this sort of violence is not tolerable, right? And then we hear the statements that we heard from the former president today. You're running a campaign. Do you respond? How do you respond? What's the right action in this moment if you're a Democrat who wants to win office, who has to sort of push back on some things?
Look, I think that the president and the vice president are handling this like they should. They are leading the country, right? They need to be the president and the vice president in this moment, not a candidate for president in the vice president's instance. So they are making it known that political violence has no place in our system. They don't think that the rhetoric, they want to tone down the rhetoric. They are making that very clear to everyone. But also, the vice president is still running a campaign. Do I think that everyone needs to tone down the language? Yes, absolutely. Should the vice president and former President Trump? Yes. But I think that what the president and the vice president have put out to date are what they need to be doing. They are leaders of this country, and they are showing leadership here.
You've been inside the bubble. As we've been listening to the Secret Service director talk about some of the things that they've done, you've traveled with the president, and been a part of that security movement. What's your take on what we heard from the Secret Service director and what concerns still exist?
You know, I think that they are doing what they need to be doing. The layered approach is really what happens on the ground. There's a lot of things that staff don't know that go on behind the scenes. When you are out with the president, it can be unsafe. To your point, you don't know what people who are on the motorcade route, what their intentions are, what they're feeling. But they are doing everything they can. Are they under-resourced? Of course they are. Do they rely a lot on local and other law enforcement partners? Yes, absolutely. But I think the Secret Service right now is doing everything that they can. I'm
sorry we had so little time to talk today, but thank you. I appreciate you all being here with us. We are back with more Meet the Press now. Tomorrow, of course, the news continues right now with Hallie Jackson.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.